Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jan Herning, and I am editor-in-chief of the Warsaw Institute. And this is a special program by the Warsaw Institute Foundation. Of course, we are going to talk about the Ukraine, what's going on with Ukraine right now. And let me introduce our guest, Mrs. Katerina Sawrańska, expert on Ukrainian affairs, Department of Mediatization Research, Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Welcome, Mrs. Sawrańska.
Hello.
And before we start, I will quote Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, who said on Twitter today, "No, this is not a Russian invasion only in the east of Ukraine, but a full-scale attack from multiple directions." Also, NBC News wrote today, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Thursday that he was imposing martial law across the country after Russian President Vladimir Putin launched a military operation targeting eastern Ukraine. And of course, indeed, on the night of February 23rd and 4th, 2022, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine. And CNN commented on the incident and wrote, Kiev has woken up to a new reality. And I will have the first question to my guest. What is the reality of people on Ukraine right now?
Well, today at 5 o'clock in the morning, Putin issued a statement that the self-proclaimed republics had asked the Kremlin for help, and they had authorized a military invasion of Ukraine, thus officially declaring war. According to Putin, the purpose of his military campaign is supposedly to protect people who have allegedly been subjected to genocide for 8 years, because NATO allegedly supports Ukrainian neo-Nazis who will never forgive Crimeans for their choice. He added that Russia would seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. They also invited Ukrainians to lay down their arms, and otherwise the entire responsibility for bloodshed will lie with the Kiev regime. He said, addressing the Western countries, he threatened that if, and I quote maybe, that if they interfere, Russia's response will be immediate and lead to consequences that Western countries have never faced before in their history. The Russian armed forces fire more than 30 missiles at aircraft and artillery in Ukrainian civilian and military infrastructure. Today, the enemy continues the offensive with the support of army aircraft crossing the Ukrainian border in the direction of Romansk, Kherson, Chaplinka, Kakhovka, and the work of sabotage and acknowledgement of groups in the Bessarabian operational area and in the Black Sea, also operational zone is noted. Mm, Unidentified operational groups of troops reloaded and relocated to areas of task to effectively counter Russian aggression. Operational and tactical groups of Ukraine army are engaged in defensive battles in all directions of the enemy's displacement. So the Ukrainian army managed to destroy already several Russian tanks, helicopters, planes. Russian troops are now breaking through to Kiev. So the situation is really developing very, very quickly, and it's becoming difficult to keep track of it sometimes.
Yes, as you said, Ukrainian armed forces are fighting all the time, but we also have to admit that the war has been waged since 2014 over Crimea. But another quote I have today is President Zelensky, who tweeted today, "The world is with us. I continue negotiations with the leaders, received support from Emir of Qatar, but I would like to ask you about how Ukrainians feel right now, and do they feel this support of the free world actually?"
Well, I have 2 points here. Maybe The first point is that the actual support of Western and non-Western countries, which have previously assisted Ukraine in the field of security, that is supplying by weapons, organizing exercises with Ukrainian military, as well as the financial field, by imposing a number of sanctions against Russia. Obviously, no one will directly interfere in the military conflict for obvious reasons, but there is support in other areas, like sanctions I mentioned before. So the second point, maybe, is my personal experience. Right now, I am receiving tons of messages of support. So many that I don't have time to read and respond to them all. And I really appreciate it.
Yes, and you mentioned the sanctions, and we have to admit that Joe Biden imposed the first tranche, the first part of the sanctions already planned if Russia invades Ukraine. And I wanted to ask you, how do you assess these proposals from the American side? Do you find them like they are enough right now, or the United States, NATO countries should act more? They should act more decisive way right now.
So I will start with some general information that Western countries have adopted a series of tough sanctions already amid weakening the Russian economy and its ability to modernize. For instance, Germany has decided to finally suspend the operation of Nord Stream 2. The EU will freeze Russian assets and block Russian banks' access to the European financial market. Some sanctions are also being imposed against businessmen who finance Russian operation in the Donetsk and Luhansk territories, or just profit from these activities. Several countries have already suspended visas for Russian citizens. As for the U.S., in its first sanctions package this week, as far as I remember, they banned secondary market purchases of bonds issued after the 1st of March this year. Um, a little bit later, they imposed also blocking sanctions against the financial institutions that played a key role in financing the Russian defense industry and military assets, holding like tens of billions of dollars in combined assets. Thus, the state corporation like WebRF and Promsvязьbank, a military bank, fall under the sanctions. These sanctions guarantee that this WebRF and Promsvязьbank will no longer be available to do business in the United States and will be cut off from the American financial system. So today's decision limits Russia's ability to finance defense contracts and raise new funds to finance its campaign against Ukraine. So on Tuesday, as far as I remember, after Putin's speech, Russian stock exchanges already collapsed on a scale not seen since the 2008 global financial crisis. Ruble plunged the most in 2 years. The Moscow Exchange Index continues to plummet. It has already fallen by more than a third, like minus 34% since yesterday's close trading day. Among the leading companies in terms of share value decline are Gazprom, Lukoil, VTB, Magnit, and Russian social media Vkontakte. All of this is direct loss for Russian business and the population. Of course, news actions are still being prepared, but we'll be able to assess the real economic losses for Russia in the near future already. However, it is difficult to say whether these steps will stop someone who stubbornly continues to want escalation. Unfortunately, I doubt.
Yes, I will quote here American sources. The first executive order, which was signed by Joe Biden prohibits the new investments in the covered regions by the US person, import of any goods, services, or technology from these regions to the United States, and exports of any goods, services, or technologies from the United States or by a US person to these regions. The executive order further prohibits US persons from financing, facilitating, or guaranteeing transactions by foreign persons that US persons would be prohibited from engaging directly. And here another question which is being raised very often is Ukraine joining NATO. And we know that during those negotiations in Geneva and later on between the United States and Russia, we know that this was one of the key demands from the Russian side, that NATO will declare that Ukraine will not join NATO. And I wanted to ask you, do you think there is any chance for Ukraine to join NATO in the nearest future? What do Ukrainians think about joining the alliance? Do the social attitudes are the social attitudes in favor of Ukraine joining NATO?
Well, starting from an optimistic point of view, in this situation, it is very important that the Ukrainian army holds out as long as possible with today's war in Ukraine against Russia, and the Ukrainian army is able to repel attacks by Russian troops. It is the main condition nowadays. Because NATO will not accept into its ranks a country that is at war with another state. After all, this would mean that the alliance would need to provide military assistance to Ukraine under Article 5 of Collective Security Treaty. So, however, from long-term perspective and provided the conflict is resolved, the likelihood of Ukraine joining NATO could be high. Even considering that it's about 60% of Ukrainians support such a decision, and among those who would definitely take part in the vote, the percentage of supporters of joining NATO would be about 67%.
Yes, and wanted to ask you because, of course, you're Ukrainian. I wanted to ask about your personal experience related to this situation, which is happening in the East right now. What information do you get, maybe from your family, your friends, relatives? How does it look like right now from the perspective of, Ukrainian citizens? Maybe they are a little confused. Maybe they are escaping. We saw these lines. Leaving Kiev, for example, line of cars going to the west. Actually, what is your approach to this? What is the approach of Ukrainians?
Well, as soon as I heard about what had happened early this morning, the first thing I did was to contact my acquaintances in colleges in Ukraine to see if they were okay. I heard very similar horror stories from them about how they were awakened around 5 a.m. by whistling, rumbling, and explosions. They looked out of the window and saw rockets flying. Many were seized by chilling fear and panic. They immediately rushed to check if there was communication in the internet, and already on the news they saw Putin's statement and realized that a war had begun. Now there are huge lines on the streets for stores, banks. Many people are trying to withdraw cash and stock up on groceries, so there are already empty shelves in the stores. People are panic stricken, and they are understandable. Many have nowhere else to go. It's a pity. And many spoke of frustration with the Ukrainian army for allowing air attacks, which naturally echoes Russian propaganda and this public sentiment plays into Russians' hands. And that's the most dangerous thing. in 8 years, many good think tanks and fact-checking organizations have emerged in Ukraine that work to refute Russian narratives. Um, on the one hand, um, part of the population has become more trusting of the Ukrainian media, but on the other hand, there is still a part of the population that believe Russian propaganda. And I do not know these exact figures, but I do hope that the balance is still on the Ukrainian side.
And another question, how big the wave of migrants from Ukraine might be, especially the people who are leaving the country, escaping from war. How many people would you expect to leave, for example, to Eastern EU countries like Poland, for example? Because we heard that it might be possible that the wave will be pretty big, and also Polish cities on the border with Ukraine are already being prepared to host Ukrainian refugees.
Well, as I heard from the latest polls, many Ukrainians want to stay in Ukraine and defend their country.
Mhm.
And they don't want to do not want to leave the country abroad. So it's difficult to predict how many people will go to the west. Maybe thousands of people, maybe more, maybe less. It's depending.
And
It depends on the
mhm.
situation that is going on right now.
Yes, and talking about the situation, would you expect it to develop even more? Can it transform into, maybe right now it's a full kinetic conflict, let's say, but can it transform to be even bigger conflict, or do you think this what we already saw today in media, on Twitter, internet, this is all, and Putin will withdraw because he will know that the West is getting serious about the sanctions, about the military response if he decides to attack maybe Eastern NATO countries. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I would like to emphasize that Ukraine has already had 8 years of experience in common aggression with Russia. So I think the Ukrainian military had its own thoughts on Russia's plan, and they know how to fight against it. So according to some reports, the Ukrainian army managed to remove military equipment in advance from the areas of air attack. That is like from military bases. So I think that intelligence is working well, and the Ukrainian military was prepared for today's battle and continues to hold back the Ukrainian offensive. So I really hope that Ukrainian army will try to defend its country, and Ukraine will win.
Yes, we all stand together with Ukraine, and in the end of our today's program, I will just simply read the Warsaw Institute's announcement on the case of the conflict on Ukrainian border and in Ukraine. The Warsaw Institute stands in solidarity with Ukraine, which was attacked by the regime of Vladimir Putin. As an organization, we condemn any signs of escalation of the conflict on the part of the Russian Federation and support the territorial integrity of the Ukrainian state. We all hope the war will finish, and the people who are guilty for this escalation will be punished. My guest was Katerina Savranska, expert on the Ukrainian Affairs Department of Mediatization Research, Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Thank you.